Thanks, Valery. Can I make a suggestion? Everybody stand up. Turn around. Just do a 360. Do it again. Okay, arms up, arms down. There we go. Now sit down again. Okay, thank you. Now sit down again, because I see that you need a little bit of a yes. Thank you. Okay, it's extremely difficult to speak after a Nobel laureate. I'm honored that Valery has asked me to do that. Alexandra is, as you probably know, is a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I'm not, but I have one point of pride. I have one point of pride, and that is that Valery Pekel is my former student, and that is actually something that I'm very, very proud of. I have been teaching in Ukraine for the last 22 years. I've been involved in higher education reform. I've been very lucky in terms of being involved in multiple things that are going on in Ukraine. I'm an observer. I'm what's called in sociology a participant observer. So I've had the ability to be part of two protest movements, which we call revolutions, a minor war and now a major war. That's, for someone who's a participant observer, a pretty amazing life. For those of you that haven't figured it out yet, my background from my accent, which I've been trying to get rid of for many, many years, is Canadian. I spent 27 years of my life in Canada, 4 years in Great Britain, and now 22 in Ukraine. Ukraine is obviously home. Yeah, but the accent is still there. I want to talk a little bit today about what we're doing in terms of higher education. I was asked to talk about that. I've only been deputy minister for 15 months, 16 months, I guess now. I'm counting the months. This is not a permanent job. I'm not planning on being a civil servant for the rest of my life. This is, to a large extent, a volunteering piece. Some people volunteer on the front. I'm a terrible shot. I don't know how to throw grenades. I'm sure I could learn, but I think I could probably be a little bit more useful in terms of doing things for higher education. What we're doing at the moment, I had a friend of mine who is involved in medical system reform, and he had a very interesting observation that it turns out that, is anyone here British? No? Yes, okay. So it turns out that the NHS, which is the National Health Service, which is to a large extent a point of pride and a system of medical provision that has become the model for generally in Europe and in Canada, not in the United States, but certainly in the English-speaking world and in the European continent, was actually designed during the Blitz. A bunch of people were sitting in bomb shelters during the Battle of Britain and thinking about how would they like to see their medical system after the victory over the Nazi potential invasion. Thankfully, it didn't happen as an invasion, but certainly it destroyed much of Great Britain. We are in a similar situation where we are in a state of war designing a new system of education. To some of us, it looks like transforming a Spitfire into an F-16 in flight while under heavy anti-aircraft fire. That's kind of the reality. We have a good educational system, and I insist on the fact that it is a good educational system, but it needs to be made into a fighter jet. It needs to be modernized, and we're doing this while we are in flight because we have students that are learning. Many of them have gone into Europe, and many of them are coming back now. So we need to be transforming in flight, and obviously we need to be dealing with the war at the same time. The effect of the war has been very uneven. So we have sections of the country that are under occupation, sections of the country that were under occupation, and sections of the country that really have not been largely affected by the war. Obviously, we are all affected by periodic air raid sirens, etc., but there is a clear difference between, well, places like Kharkiv, right, and Zakarpattia. Okay, so Zakarpattia, for example, has had one missile on it, on the entire oblast in the last 2.5 years, and has had several drone attacks. But the difference, obviously, is massive when compared to Kharkiv, which is daily under aerial bombardment. And The reason I mention Kharkiv is because Kharkiv is Ukraine's second city, and it has the largest number of universities, traditionally the largest number of students, and the largest number of researchers. This building that you see on the left-hand side, upper left, is the former Faculty of Economics of Kharkiv University. The building that you see on the right is the former Children's Hospital, or I guess it is still a children's hospital. It's now under reconstruction. It happens to be 300 meters away from the Ministry of Education building. It was loud that day. We were all involved in first aid and trying to comfort those children that were affected by this. Thankfully, many of them, or I would say most of them, were in bomb shelters when that rocket hit. In the last month, in August of 2024, we've had 680 kamikaze drones fired at us. 655 were shot down. As you can see, we've become very good at shooting down kamikaze drones. We are not as good, unfortunately, at shooting down ballistic and cruise missiles. We're shooting down approximately 50% at this point. Air defenses for us are key. That's may not seem to be related to education, but it is related to education because a very large proportion of those missiles and drones have been falling on educational institutions, be it on universities, be it on schools, high schools, whatever. Damages and losses to Ukraine's energy sector exceed $56 billion. That's a number that I can't personally fathom. It is a number that is comparable to the budget of many European countries, yearly budgets. Energy infrastructure at this point, 80% of our thermal power plants, 50% of our hydroelectric plants have been destroyed. That means that the winter will be very difficult for me as someone who is responsible for education. That means that our educational system will be under extreme stress this winter. We were very lucky that last winter was relatively warm. At the same time, the energy infrastructure has been destroyed much more in the last few months. Therefore, this winter will be very difficult. One of the things that we have at the moment is a program for donations from from multiple universities around Western Europe who are providing generators which will be used for heating and providing electricity to dormitories and to academic institutions. So much of my time has to do with that. When it comes to what we've done in terms of the last 2 years since the full-scale invasion, war-related challenges to the higher education system included distorted learning and research, risk of coherence of academic communities, because in fact it's been 4 years of online rather than 2 years or 2.5, COVID, we went offline in September of 2021, and in February of 2022, we again went online. So we have our first cohort of students at this point who are graduating who have been in the classroom for 1 semester. And that obviously is affecting educational quality, that's affecting everything that has to do with coherence of academic communities, and it's also created a risk of brain drain. We are grateful to multiple partners in Europe and throughout the world that have set up things like university networks, twinning, joint research projects. Symbolically, it's been very important for us that Russian higher education institutions and quality assurance agencies have been removed from global institutions. That has been something that has been extremely important to us because we believe that the Russian education system has failed Russian society, because one of the things that educational systems do is instill values. And we believe in all of our global declarations in the European higher education area, we have always been talking about democratic values as being something that is extremely important to the higher education paradigm. Russia has failed, and it was very important for us to see that the Russian Federation expelled from most of those institutions. Visiting professorships and limited non-residential fellowships have also been involved, and this has been important. Looking into the medium and long term, we have several challenges. We are very much promoting at this point joint degree programs, particularly in something called a COIL format, which is Collaborative Online International Learning, where part of the classroom is in one country, another part of the classroom will be in another university, and there will be a joint online lecture, and that program will actually be in a joint seminar format as well. In other words, we have the technology today to be able to do these types of collaborative online platforms, and this is something that we're developing extensively. with many of our partners. Targeted funding for joint MA and PhD programs has happened already, and that's been very good, and we've been very grateful to that, because as I say, brain drain is a huge problem. Although we are very grateful to many of our partners who have accepted Ukrainian students and Ukrainian faculty to their universities in 2022, 2023, but the official policy of the Ukrainian government is we want our brains at home. We need our people home. And we understand that it is not possible to come home if your home has been destroyed. In other words, if you are from Zaporizhia, if you are from Kharkiv, if you are from Mariupol, coming home means what? It's a difficult question. But if you are from Kyiv, if you are from Lviv, if you are from Ternopil, if you are from Chernivtsi, Ivano-Frankivsk, Wynnyckyj, multiple cities throughout Ukraine, yes, it is distressing to feel an air raid siren. You've all heard them. But at the end of the day, we need our brains at home because we have a country to build and a war to win. Joint research and human capital, infrastructure and capacity building, expanded twinning. These are some of the priorities which you can read here. I'm not going to read them back to you. It's simply a scenario of these are some of the things that we're working on together with our international partners at this point. I'm honored that today, in addition to be able to talk as a policymaker and a policy influencer, I'm actually able to talk to you a little bit as someone who's an academic. And I'm hoping that you'll allow me the luxury of talking about things that are not necessarily directly policy related. Universities. Universities are a result and also a seed of the way societies are structured. Universities, as we know them, classical universities, were the result and also, to a large extent, the seed of industrial society. If you remember your university education, you remember that it was highly, highly hierarchical. You'll have a rector, you'll have a dean, you'll have a chair, you'll have a professor, you'll have an assistant, you'll have graduate students, you'll have undergraduate students, and hopefully maybe someday you'll be able to climb that ladder. We are instilling hierarchies from the very beginning. We're instilling structures from the very beginning because you have lectures, and God forbid you not attend a lecture. You have libraries which are cataloged, right? And you come to a library and you understand the catalog and you understand sort of the secret instructions of going through the catalog. And then you have a seminar where you have to actually answer back to a professor, and that professor will tell you, or the professor's assistant will tell you whether you're right or wrong. You have deadlines, you have exams. It's very, very structured. Everything about a classical university learning environment is always about structure and instilling the concept of hierarchy. I think many of you have probably seen, there's this wonderful sort of clip, I think on TikTok or Facebook or something like that, of, does your university education actually matter? Well, your employer wants to see that you were able to actually spend 4 years going through deadlines, listening to people, perhaps learning something, but that was really up to you. But the point is, it was about instilling a structure to your way of life. That was about an industrial society. That's what industrial society is all about. It's about structure and hierarchy. It's about understanding instructions. It's about being able to, if you like, act upon those instructions within certain deadlines, etc. One might say, well, what about knowledge generation? Well, knowledge generation is obviously a very, very important function of traditional universities, but let's take a look at how it's done. There's this thing, if you're into universities, called publish or perish. You either produce or you don't move up the hierarchy. It's the way it works, right? So it's about producing an output. It's very much about the idea of producing a product, an output that will be then purchased or at least cited by someone else, right? When we look at a post-industrial model, because I think you and I are all, this group of people is probably at least a little bit about understanding the concept of progress, right? We're looking at a post-industrial model. We look at the way companies like Google are organized. We look at the way or non-governmental organizations are organized. It's not about hierarchy. It's about situational leadership and collegial decision-making. It's about multiple sources of learning and multiple sources of gaining information. Much less structured in terms of programming, much more agency in terms of the actual actors in the system. Collective research teams. So when I have my European Commission recommendations that come at me as Deputy Minister, and they tell me what I should be doing in terms of having to institute policy in order to get into the European Union, I obviously do them because that is a government priority, but I look at them rather skeptically, because the European government or the European Union is telling us, develop a plan for relevant statistical data collection, analysis, and sharing mechanism for education and training. So the priority is let's get the statistics right? Let's not worry about what a university is all about, how the quality of university education, but the statistics are important, right? Start implementing a plan to optimize the network of educational institutions, because you understand, Ukrainians, you have too many universities. That's true. I understand that. That's true. But the question is not in quantity, the question is quality. Right? The issue is, what kind of institutions are we building? Not necessarily the number of standardized institutions. So if you see me being a little bit skeptical of the European recommendations, you're probably hearing a little bit of an echo of what Johan was saying this morning. Johan was the big guy, about being a little bit skeptical of who's joining whom, right? And who's affecting whom. Adopting legislation to modernize and regulate professional education is obviously important. I don't disagree with any of this, but I do want to dig a little bit deeper. Because I think that what we are experiencing today is what sociologists, there's a wonderful French sociologist by the name of Pierre Bourdieu, who talks about the concept of fields, right? So that the idea of habitus is sort of the way that we do things within a field. A field is something that legitimizes our practices and creates structures, how we structure our own interaction. And fields in industrial society are always very hierarchical. They're always about processes. We will always talk about bureaucracies. We'll talk about outputs. We'll talk about things that are KPI, right? These are always things that are key performance indicators. These are always things about industrial society. In a war, fields are disrupted. I don't think that that's actually something that is very new to anyone. It's not just about the horrific things that Alexandra was talking about in terms of people getting maimed and injured and raped and killed, but it's also about the survivors thinking and acting in different ways. So there's a disruption or a critical juncture in what happens. So specifically, established norms and structures cease to operate. And you see this process, which those of you that are sociologists like me will have heard a thing called morphogenesis. So we're not creating something completely new. It's not genesis. We're morphing out of existing structures and existing practices. Change depends on degree of social disruption. So if you're in a local crisis, that'll be less of a degree. If you're in an extensive crisis, we're in a bigger degree. Obviously, when you're in a full-scale invasion, that's a catastrophic crisis, and it will have catastrophic, or if you like, fundamental changes on the way that you act. The universal reaction of people will be something called elaboration of the way that we do things traditionally. In other words, it's not about, okay, today I've been bombed and therefore I'm going to be working in a different way or acting in a different, or believing different things or thinking in different ways. I still have this anchor of my past. So I'll still be thinking and acting, but evolution will become, or if you like, development will become much more fast, much quicker. And the role of charismatic leadership becomes very, very important. This is actually not new. Back in 1992, a fellow by a Marxist writer by the name of Ken Jowett wrote about this. He talks about a genesis environment. So leaders count more than institutions, charisma more than political economy. It's precisely in these types of epochs when existing boundaries and identities, institutional and psychological, are challenged and assaulted, and great men, or those who are considered great, will come to the fore. We've seen a lot of this, and the reaction of people that are watching it are very often saying, wow, we have authoritarian tendencies. We have a president who's being put up on a pedestal. We have, for those of you that are Ukrainian will understand this full well, we have a commander-in-chief or a former commander-in-chief who needs to be removed because he's becoming too much of a charismatic challenger to the president. In other words, we're talking about and it's not just happening in Ukraine. I mean, take a look at the U.S. election. It's about this idea of imagery of leadership rather than anything else. Certainly less about policy. And I have a question in all of that, and I think it's a very important question for all of us to understand. Yes, we're in a period of transformation. The airplane is being transformed, and it's transforming itself. It's morphing itself. But the airplane flies. The basis was there for the transformation. And the question that I always ask my Ukrainian colleagues, and this is something that Ukrainians, we have a wonderful tendency of sort of diminishing ourselves and saying that everything's bad in our country. I think it's a genetic thing. If two Ukrainians come together and they don't, they're not complaining, then it's just they're not actually having a conversation, right? So you have to complain about something, and then I'll ask a rhetorical question, guys. You realize that us, stopped an invasion, the second largest army in the world. That didn't just happen, and it didn't happen. I mean, why? We need to ask that question. What is it that allowed us to do the things that have become memes in Ukrainian society? And I'll remind you of sunflower seeds, right? And the babushka with the sunflower seeds. And I'll remind you of all of the things that happened in the first days of the war. For those of you that didn't understand that meme, there was an old lady in northern Chernihiv Oblast who was filmed when a Russian soldier came by and was convinced that she was going to welcome him because she spoke Russian, right? And she turned around and said, "Make sure you put sunflower seeds in your pocket so we find your body next year." Okay, so we'll be able to identify where because you're not getting out of here alive. Okay, that was and this is a lady who's like 75 years old. Okay, who remembers the Soviet Union, who remembers all of this, and she was speaking Russian. And she was telling this Russian soldier that I want no part of you, right? In other words, this idea of grassroots, that's really grassroots. When the babushka's 75 and she's telling the soldier that, you're not getting out of here alive, that's grassroots resistance. Where does that come from? Well, it didn't come from nothing, right? It came from an educational system. It came from a values system. It comes from something which I think is very interesting. Kremlin misconceived the reality of Ukraine. They were expecting to be welcomed. Putin seems to have believed his own propaganda, which has become part of his problem. There was a myth of an invincible Russian army at the time, strengthened by many years of propaganda of the Russians supposedly won the Second World War. Ukrainians have something to say about that. Incompetent command structure in the Russian army. In other words, the Ukrainians will always look at these sorts of things and say, well, it's not actually us that stopped them, it's just that they were so incompetent that they couldn't really do anything. Reality is we stopped them, right? 2022, we did something to stop an army, and we did something to stop an army that no one believed we would have. And this is something that we call unexpected agency. It's totally unexpected. Sign was put up in New York on the New York subway. I thought it was brave until I saw Ukraine. Multiple grassroots movement, territorial defense, volunteer logistics, total support for the armed forces, the concept of a beehive. This is an idea that I came up with in May of 2022. I spent the first months of the invasion doing interviews for CNN, BBC, Fox News, etc. My accent kind of helps me with that sort of thing. So I was pretty active on the information front, and I was trying to explain these types of things to a Western audience. Not easy. So I came up with a metaphor. It was called the beehive. Right? So Ukrainians are bees. Yes, it's important to have a queen. It's important to have a leader, right? But the bees don't take instructions from the leader. It would seem the bees know exactly what to do independently, and they kind of put themselves together into these teams. And they're effective, right? And it's something that is very counterintuitive to many of us that thinks in terms of an industrial paradigm. The Russian army is organized in an industrial paradigm. It's about a leader, commanders, and it's very hierarchical. It's about procedures, etc. I'm always fascinated by this future-focused outlook. Ukrainians even today are talking about where are we going to be after the victory. As Father Andriy likes to tell us, maybe we should secure a victory first, right? But we do a lot of thinking about what is the new country that we're going to be building after the victory, right? Whereas the Russians, in terms of their whole discourse is about history, right? They're justifying the war in terms of history. So it's a past outlook versus a future outlook, and I think that's something that's perhaps a key to building new structures. The war is not about language rights. I think we all understand that, and it's certainly not about NATO, and it's certainly not about Nazis. It's about something different, which we simply say it's about Ukraine and Ukrainians. But I think it's important for us to understand what it is, because as someone who's building education policy, and I'll remind you, my first statement was, universities are the result and the seed of new structures. So industrial society became industrial because it was invented in universities, and universities tended to recreate the structures of industrial society. In a post-industrial society, perhaps we should be thinking differently. When we talk about the unexpected success of Ukrainian forces, we talk about high-tech weaponry, we talk about patriotism, but most importantly, we talk about team structures. We talk about the fact that it was more about hunting than fighting. I remember in my sort of courtyard here in Kyiv, the courtyard, we have an apartment and sort of a courtyard of multiple apartments, and that was a staging ground for multiple teams that would go off and do some hunting. And what were they hunting? They were hunting Russians. The Russians were coming in to fight. They were met by small teams of forces of people that were going on a hunt. It's a very different kind of paradigm. It's a very different kind of way of thinking. And the word that we use for it in sociology is heterarchy. It's not hierarchy. It's not flat. There's always leadership. But the leadership is situational. The leadership is temporary. The leadership is about leading a small team, perhaps a larger team, but you don't necessarily have to be anointed with a particular sort of legitimacy of office, if you like. And I think that that's something that perhaps is rooted quite clearly in Ukrainian history. Cossacks. It's something that we're about. It's something that that this idea of the sort of the frontiersman, the person that does not recognize authority because the reason that he became a hunter in the steppe was because of the fact that he wanted to get away from authority. He wanted to get away from the serfs, not become a serf, become a free person. Something that we saw again in the First World War. We've seen it multiple times during our revolutionary periods, during protests. Funny enough, one of the reasons that I think we've become very successful in the IT industry is because IT industries are not about hierarchies. IT companies are always about teams and a different way of structuring things. So the vision of Ukraine as corrupt was wrong. I think that a lot of us believed that, and I think that Johan was talking about this a little bit, so I'm kind of talking about it a little bit more. According to generally accepted views, Ukrainians' political and economic system constitutes something that's patronal, hierarchical, problematic, etc. Well, it turns out that really highly criticized society turned out to be extremely effective in fighting a war. And General McChrystal, who's a U.S. Army general who was responsible for multiple operations in Iraq, wrote a book that didn't really fly very well called Team of Teams. And if you are interested in getting a sort of an English language idea of what the resistance was like here, that book, I think, it talks about Iraq, it doesn't talk about Ukraine. But it's a lot about what we were, the structures that were created and the mindset, to a large extent, that led to a certain amount of victory. Heterarchic structures. I'm going to finish probably a little quicker because I probably need to end. Our strategic priorities in the Ministry of Education very often have to do with sort of very fundamental, or if you like, easily understandable for educators, policy priorities. Things like university autonomy, student agency, quality of teaching and learning, academic community development, and obviously all of that is compounded by the fact that we're dealing with an ongoing war, which means that we have to deal with shelters and evacuation and infrastructure, and most importantly, energy. But I think that one of the things that we try to do as much as we can is to try to say, okay, these are all policy priorities that need to be done now, but we need to not forget about the fact that there is a different kind of structure that we're trying to build in addition to all of these. In other words, there's a reason for university autonomy. It's not just about putting a check mark on a European document or a European Commission document. It's also about thinking about creating a new kind of community within universities. When we talk about student agency, It's about a different kind of trajectory, but it's also about empowering students to come together in communities, come together in teams, learn in different ways. So we have a war to win and a country to build. We have a winter to survive. But as we've done previously, I'm sure we will. We will survive it. And I have a feeling that we may end up surprising a lot of people in Europe when we do actually enter the European Union, because I'm not sure who's entering whom at this point, and who will need to be doing some adjustments. This is a frontier, and the frontiers tend to be very innovative and then influencing of, if you like, metropoles eventually. History is all about stories like that, and I think that this is something that we're living through at the moment. So if you want to ask some questions, you're more than welcome. Yeah, please.
Could you talk more about the historical sources of agency? So we've heard several speakers talk about why is, that Ukraine is particularly agentic, or that it's something deep in the culture. Could you expand on that?
There's a lot of myths about this, because the problem, of course, is there's a historical myth that brings Ukrainians together, and that has to do with the 17th and 18th century massive rebellions that occurred in the territory that is sort of the edge of the forest land, which is the forest geography sort of ends a little bit south of Kyiv, and then the steppe begins, and that's sort of large grasslands. There's multiple interpretations of that historical frontier land, if you like. One has to do with geography, one has to do with trade routes, another one has to do with the steppe being a place of, if you like, although freedom, but also the borderland was one of freedom, but as soon as you get further into the east, you get much more into an autocratic hierarchical society. I think it's the best way of looking at it is this. If you know anything, I used to do a lot of American history, and Americans tend to have this, I guess, the myth of the Wild West, right? So we've seen a lot of films about the Wild West and cowboys and that sort of thing. Well, I think there is a myth in Ukrainian society about the Cossacks being the Wild East, if you like. And when you are free and you're contrasting constantly to this non-free, and you're fighting for this freedom, it's about taking responsibility for yourself. And that's, I think, this idea of agency. Now, why this is controversial is because I'm talking about a myth, a historical myth, that goes back to the 17th and 18th century. Obviously, there's this minor little thing that happens, it's called 70 years of Soviet rule, and another 100 years of Russian imperial rule, right? So how is it that this historical legacy has survived both Russian imperial rule and also the Soviet period? I don't have an answer for that that's anything more than, if you like, a non-academic one. There's this importance of historical myth and mythology that is passed down, and it has to do with a national identity which is perhaps imagined, but nevertheless important for values creation. I don't know if I answered that question. That's that's not an easy one to answer quickly.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Mychailo, that your extremely tough schedule.
Just you have one more.
Take it up later, but I was wondering now about what support movements to Ukraine, especially in Europe, can learn about the beehive structures that are actually defending Ukraine or were part of.
I'm not sure they're actually defending Ukraine at this point. I think that one of the things that we found out is that this was extremely effective for the first year or so, and now the front has become much more of a frontal war. And when you are fighting a frontal war, it is very difficult to fight it in small teams, right? And it is very difficult to fight it for long term. One of the questions that I have as someone who's an organizational sociologist and someone who teaches in business schools is, how do we make heterarchy something that is sustainable over a long term? It's a natural reaction short term, but longer term, how do we make this into a system of interaction? We like to say in business schools, we like to say that culture eats structure, or culture eats strategy for breakfast. That's a nice saying, but how do we now build that culture that's going to be about small teams, situational leadership, taking responsibility, agency, all of these things that we see happening spontaneously in a crisis situation. How do we make it normal? So I don't have an answer to your question. There's a lot of research that I think needs to still be done, and I'm really hoping to get out of this ministry job to be able to do it. Okay, thanks.